Welcome back for those of you here last night, and welcome to those who are here the first time. This is a special panel because it's the one where the chair gets to say next to nothing, we think, we hope. Why women should rule the world. And firstly, just by way of introduction, this event has been live streamed to a number of venues around the country. And I just want to welcome, so not just a live stream of audio, but people looking at it on the big screens as well. Local events hosted by writers groups, art centres, universities, libraries, 20 locations across New South Wales, Queensland, the Northern Territory, Victoria and South Australia. A number of centres, and we welcome for the first time Adelaide and Wagga Wagga, and we'll be taking some questions later. If we do get time, we might take a question or two off the live feed. So if you're in one of our live sites, please send your questions through. Now, I'm going to keep the introductions as short as possible. Gloria, first I'll introduce. Very, very long CV, but I think the best thing that can be said is that you've lived consistently over the last 50 years by the motto of trying to include everybody in conversations. I think your body of work is extraordinary. Again, needs no introduction, but just one thing I noticed that when Barack Obama awarded you the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013, he said, that you've been called a champion noticer, which is a lovely credit, alert to all the ways, large and small, that women have been, and in some cases continue to be treated unfairly just because they are women. Now, Ira Trivedi is a best-selling author and a yoga instructor. Just to add to your line of credits, India in Love. In fact, we're going to be talking at some length about the observations of the sexual and marriage revolution in India. You're also author of Walking Towards Ourselves, which I think you just mentioned quickly.
Yes.
Sorry?
It's an anthology, yes.
Yes. And Laura Tingle, fellow commentator and author, quarterly essayist, and she's my last habit in the media. I'd say I always go to a column on Friday in the Financial Review whilst I skirt around everything else that distracts me in the digital world. So welcome all to our panel. We'll obviously have time for longer conversations in the book signings afterwards. And I want to begin with an observation from an old man, a very old man called Warren Buffett, who did make the point again just a couple of years ago that the terrible mistake that the US and many other countries have made over the past few centuries was to deny themselves the full use of all their talent. They did this by relegating women to just a few occupations, and the point he made that the key to the future was that only true equality in the workplace would allow societies to fulfil their full potential. Gloria, if I could just get you, I don't want you to necessarily give a history lecture, but in the last 50 or so years, you've observed some changes about the position of women in work, in the boardrooms and in the highest office in the land. What's changed and what still needs to be done?
Just a little question like that, right?
Just a little one to start with.
Describe the universe and give two examples.
Yes.
Women have entered into the public sphere, into what we call the work life, and we have made huge strides, obviously. This is in large part because we also have been able more to control our own fertility, decide when and whether to have children, and so on. I mean, we all know the strides that women have made in our respective countries, I think, into the public sphere. The problem is that men have not made as many strides into the private sphere. And I would only say to Warren Buffett, a really, really good guy, that he's just talking about half the revolution. There is the other half. And if women should rule the world, it's temporary until men are able to develop all the full range of human qualities, all those qualities wrongly called feminine, because they're just the qualities necessary to raise children: patience, attention to detail, empathy, and men have those too. You know, the the differences, the overall differences between males and females in terms of the full circle of human qualities is way less than the unique differences in one person. So our title is temporary. I do not want women to
Thank you.
be burdened with running the whole world. But I do think that the way we phrase it assumes that the superior thing was superior. You know, it assumes that public life is superior to private life, or that, you know, actually raising children is so much more interesting than most of what goes on in corporations, right? So, so I just want to speak for the circularity of it and the fact that we do all have the same human qualities, and this ridiculous idea that you know, I really, really think the world is divided into two kinds of people: those who divide everything into two and those who don't, okay? So, I would like to speak for the reality of the full circle and not necessarily dividing everything into two, even though we may have to do that for what is now remedial action. But I hope we remember that for most of human history, we were traveling in small groups. Both men and women were looking after the children. The languages didn't have gender. People were people, you know. I say that because otherwise I fear we think it's human nature to be the way we are, and we get discouraged from changing and becoming male and female full circle people.
Thank you. I did, there was one line in the book that, many lines jumped out in the book, but there was a line in the book about, very, very early on, about the first things you observed coming into the public sphere in the 60s in journalism and then in campaigning, that, you know, the Congress was male, the face of welfare was female, that if women weren't in the workforce, they were assumed not to be working, even though they did more unpaid labour than anybody else. If we track some of those observations you made when you first sort of entered the public sphere, the steps that, and I don't want to go into too much detail about what's changed, but clearly some things have changed, but some things are still very, very, very almost intractable at the moment within our culture.
Yeah, well, we've approached, I mean, if we think it's superior, we imagine everyone wants it. Yeah. So we imagine everybody wants to be in the paid labor force. If we think it's inferior, we imagine people don't want it. But in fact, men want to be close to their children and want to raise their children. And, you know, we just don't count that in the same way. And it's ridiculous that we define as work only that which could be done by men. Actually. I mean, a third of the productive work in both of our countries, and even more in many countries, is raising kids and caregiving, raising children, taking care of invalids, elderly, you know. Right now that has no economic value whatsoever, and we cannot plan properly for our economies because it doesn't. We could, as Marilyn Waring in your neighboring New Zealand pointed out, we could attribute an economic value to caregiving at replacement level and make it tax deductible if we pay taxes, or tax refundable if we're too poor to pay taxes. I mean, our problems are definitional still about what work is.
Ira, could I give you a shot and without going into too much depth, India at the moment is on the cusp of possibly one of the most remarkable transformations of any large society in all of human history. If I could put it that grandiosely. The last 15 years, I mean, here in Australia we talk a lot about the rise of China, but it's actually the rise of China in India that's changing the world as we know it today. In the last 15 years or so, you describe in your book that there's a sexual and a marriage revolution, and it's not linear like it was in the West. It's chopping all over the place. Maybe just give you the floor for a few minutes to describe what's been going on in India, and maybe do a bit of a compare and contrast, if it's possible to do, with our experience in Australia and the US.
Okay, so now let's see if this is possible in about 60 seconds. But so India has not had a feminist revolution the way the West has. There has been no bra burning. There's been no law changing on a large degree. We've not had to come out on the streets in the past many years to do these things. In fact, India is very good at changing laws because that's easy to do. It's easy to go around and make a law on dowry or make a law on marriage. But the problems in India are far deeper. They go down to a much deeper social, cultural sense. But what's happened in the past 10 to 15 years is that India's sexual revolution has emerged, and this has been the feminist revolution, because as sex comes out of the closet and comes into the living room conversation, it is women who are leading these conversations. It is women who are leading the sexual revolution. And sex and marriage in India still can't be separated. I said this in my book, and I'm going to say it here, is that in India, for tens of thousands of years, there's a very simple formula. You get married, you have sex, and if love comes, it comes. If it doesn't come, then it doesn't. But now the simple little formula has all sorts of permutations and combinations. And it's being changed around, and now it could be anything. It could be sex, marriage, love, sex, marriage, whatever it is. So we are moving towards a Western trajectory, but it's all happening at once. Everything is breaking down at once. So arranged marriage is breaking down, love marriages are happening, women are coming to the forefront. We have our own sort of feminist revolution happening, and on that note, people have asked me this in many other countries, and even when I've come to Australia, and it always asks, Ira, what's happening in terms of sexual violence and rape? That's a big conversation. Is it really unsafe to go out in the streets of India? Is it okay for us to visit India? And I say, listen, rape in India is not new. It's been happening for decades. What is new is that it's actually being spoken about. The young women are actually coming out to talk about their experiences. They're coming out to the streets to protest against this, and that is what the big change is. So India's feminist revolution is its sexual revolution, and that's what's so interesting about it. But we have such a deep, trenched culture of patriarchy in our country, and Gloria spoke a little bit about the labor force and women in the workplace. In India, we're battling with literacy. Only 50% of Indian women are even literate. Indian women make up 500 million women. That's 1 in every 7 women in the world is an Indian woman, and half of those are not educated. So what does that say about the state of our nation? Our Prime Minister talks about economic growth, but there's 217 million women missing from the labor force. There are women who don't have jobs. Every year, 10 million women are added who want jobs, who want to go out there and work in the labor force. That's half the population of Australia every single year, but they don't have jobs.
But one of the and you point this out in your book, one of the big drivers of this change is the emergence of a very, very large Indian middle class.
Absolutely.
So the numbers, without getting too bogged down in the detail of the numbers themselves are extraordinary.
Yeah.
By the middle of the century, pretty much India is going to define the global middle class.
Absolutely.
In terms of absolute numbers.
Absolutely.
Yep.
There's a huge urban migration, rural to urban migration, largest in the history of the universe, as people move from the villages to the cities. So in India of the future, in 15 years, is very much an urban middle class India. And in that urban middle class India, women will have a very key role to play. And we have to educate these women to be able to step into those shoes and to make them capable of ruling the world. But in all of that, I want to point out the hopeful situation. When you educate these women, when you look at numbers in schools and look at data, girls do better than boys across the board. When you look at the 10th grade results and 12th grade results, it's always women who are doing better. In fact, in colleges, there's almost a 50-50%. So women close that gender gap. And in fact, in higher education, like PhDs and technical training, there's more women than men. So it goes to show when we give women the opportunities to actually, when we educate them, they do go higher than men, and they are capable to rule the world. And I think, in fact, men know that, So they just sort of, keep them down at a young age because they know they're going to go higher. And in fact, I disagree with Gloria. I think women should rule the world because look at what men have done with it, But Laura, we can't do it without the men. We can't do it without them.
Thank you. Laura, we're going to as we sort of go from the States to India, we'll come to Australia, and I'm going to give Laura 2 questions, if I may. Firstly, let's observe the last 15 years of our story in Australia. You know, years 11 to 25 of a period of our longest uninterrupted growth. In fact, no other Western society can say that, looking back on the last 25 years, that they haven't had a deep recession. But the last 15 or so years has been sort of defined by the mining boom. Most of the action in the labour market the last 15 years, and this is when you measure up all the new jobs created in the last 15 years, on the male side of the economy, 1 in 3 of all new jobs created are in construction. The second biggest new employer of men, adding jobs, are in the professions. On the female side of the labour market, we still have this divide. 1 in 3 of the jobs created on the female side are in the caring services, in healthcare and social assistance. And the participation of women in the professions is actually falling off. It's actually not surging the way you'd imagine when you count up all the people that have sort of come out of the university system since the 80s, because in Australia, I think across pretty much every profession, you've got more women than men qualified, carrying a tertiary degree, and that's certainly the case in the States, has been for the last 30 or 40 years, but we still seem to be operating this very brawny economy on one side and a caring economy on the other. It's a very broad question, but just maybe walk the audience through some of the lived reality of the last 15 years in our labour market.
Well, I think, I mean, there are a few things that I'm going to be bad and pick up a couple of points here as well. And I think going to the points both Gloria and Ira have made, I mean, the interesting crossover in a way is, you know, at the sort of cutting edge of the labour market, if you like, and opportunity, Australia has gone a long way. You know, like, you know, it's not unusual now to see people being chief executives of companies or ministers, you know, prime ministers. You know, we have female leaders as a relatively normal thing, and that's great. But you really hit the nail on the head, I think, Gloria. The points of difficulty become both in the way women see themselves, I think, and in the way men see their role in society, is in that crossover point between public and private. You know, the fact that if men have to go home to look after the kids, they just say, well, I'm going now. This is my dinner party story, but whereas women always say, I'm sorry, I've got to go. Women still have trouble trying to assert the fact that they have to do several things at once. Now, going back to this point about the labour market, there are these interesting things that have happened over history. I mean, if you think about, people talk about the decline in the quality of teaching. I think part of the reason is that it used to be the case that women were sort of effectively trapped into a very small number of career opportunities, which meant that you got some really fantastic people, you know, going into teaching who now probably have lots of other chances. So to me, that's a very interesting thing to think about in the longer term. In the last few years, George, to get to your question,
that's right.
I think, I mean, I think pragmatically that's probably is a reflection of the economy more than any sort of, you know, sexual politics as such, because we're an ageing population. The caring professions are growing at a phenomenal rate, and I don't think it's that women, you know, are sort of prejudiced for or against, or men are, but you know, it is something where you know, they are good at it, and so in fact, in an era when aged care, for example, is just the biggest burgeoning industry in the world, in Australia, and we've got disability care becoming quite a huge sector. Women are actually going to be sort of quite dominant in a numerical sense in these sort of growth industries. But it's a bit like Gloria was saying, they're not seen as somewhere you want to be. And often, unfortunately, they have not been recompensed properly. So at the bottom end, you have a lot of migrant women who can't speak English, for example, and who have no skills, who might have once gone into manufacturing. They're now going into sort of the lower sort of levels of aged care. So I think there are sort of complex arguments within those industries about education once again, and about skill sets.
Yeah, and we've been preparing for quite a while now. We look at the male side of the labour market. We've been preparing for quite a while now for the sort of rise of this very angry middle-aged bloke who no longer sits on the middle of the income ladder. So when our economy went through that huge transition in the 70s and then into the 80s with the economic reform process, a whole lot of blue-collar men that used to sit on the middle of the income ladder suddenly became redundant. And a lot of them, as Ken Henry's observed, who lost their jobs in the 1990s recession, never worked another day in their lives. And there's been a big disruption in our politics, I think, for the last 10 or 15 years, or certainly in the 1990s from that group. But men have actually had not a bad run the last 15 years in the Australian economy. Why are they still grumpy, do you think, politically? If I can put it bluntly as that, because I'm going to bring Laura in a sec to a couple of election campaigns we've covered just recently, which might have some resonance in the American context today.
Yeah. Look, I think, I think men are grumpy, but I think a lot of people are grumpy, men or women, and I suppose my argument about that is that, you know, they have these confused expectations now about what governments can do. I argue that, you know, in Australia we've had 200 years of basically very paternalistic government. The government was always going to fix it for you. Suddenly it's not fixing it quite so much anymore, but politicians still speak the language of, you know, we can make this right for you, we can make your house cheaper, we can give you higher wages. But they've removed those levers from themselves. So I think there's a sort of an impotence involved in that people, in a Monty Python sense, are looking for the miracle of the juniper bush, you know, with their politicians, whether it's Donald Trump or any of Malcolm Turnbull now, or, you know, Tony Abbott before that, whoever it was. They think that somebody can come along and make it right in a very quickly changing world. And not only is the world changing more quickly, but the politicians' capacity to do anything about it is much reduced.
Now, let's start swinging between us. Gloria, I'll give you not so much a right to reply, but if anything you want to add to that first round of observations from the three panellists.
I think we are experiencing much of the same thing, because there was an old hierarchy that people could depend on that had to do with sex and race and class and families and so on. And all of the social justice movements, you might say, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the environmental movement too, in a lot of ways, they have become the majority in terms of consciousness, and people who feel like the old hierarchy was right and they want their place in it. I mean, I think it's especially true with the women's movement, because there are so many of us. Everyone has one at home, you know, and so, and here we are changing the balance of power. So even though the politics of resentment, which is, I think, what Trump represents, is nowhere near the majority, it's barely a third. I mean, huge swaths of people are against him, but he is speaking for an unspoken for resentment. And he also is speaking in the language that everybody can understand, when our political leaders have sometimes fallen into obscurity and all the words that end in T-I-O-N and so on. So, you know, I do not think that he is going to become president of the United States. I really think we can take care of it. But I do think he represents resentment against all of the profound changes in the social justice movements that have happened, also of a transfer of wealth, which we have had in a much more severe way than you have had here, so that, for instance, the Walmart family it has more wealth than the entire bottom third of the United States. And the average CEO earns something like 435 times the average salary earner, when in Canada it's like 75 times. I mean, you know, we have gone through in the last maybe 30 years, for reasons, you know, we can explain, but it takes a profound polarization of wealth that should be resented. It is wrong. And then the question is, who do you blame? You know, do you blame the rich people Or do you blame somebody who's just saying how you feel? I mean, Trump is an outrageous employer, a biased employer. He's a rich guy who in no way deserves to be a rich guy. He inherited $200 million. If he'd invested it, he would have been richer than he is. I mean, he's not even a good businessman. So it's irrational for this resentment of polarized wealth to settle on him, but he's been the spokesperson.
But there's been, and this is quite an interesting observation in the way the US political system, which is a voluntary voting system, has tried to negotiate, social and economic change. And so there was the big flip towards the end of the 60s into the 70s after the civil rights movement, where the Republicans, certainly in the South, were turning former Democrat voters into Republican voters because they didn't like racial equality, the idea of racial equality. There was also, and I can speak specifically for the Australian example, there was a so-called gender gap in political voting behaviour. Women tended more often than not to vote Conservative in the 50s and 60s in Australia, and then there was, when the economy started to open up and female participation in work increased, they switched to the Labor Party from the 80s onwards, and now you have the gender gap operating in the other direction. So you have, and I want you to observe more specifically in the American case, you do have these, and it's a question of who to blame, the way you put it. You do have these power structures, these two parties picking off the group that may have achieved a social advance, but not necessarily an economic advance, because they aren't able yet to back up the social advance, the legislative advance with political power, and the other side basically uses them as the wedge. Do you think that seems to be a repeating pattern, first on race and then on gender in the US political system?
When you were saying conservative, though, I was thinking it depends what we call conservative. For instance,
yes, and that's the hard. I think that's the hard.
The gender gap used to be, say in the 1950s and the 40s and Eisenhower, it used to be called conservative because women were more likely to vote for expenditures on health, education, and welfare. We still are, but now it's called radical. It's the it's the title that changed, yes, not the voting pattern.
Yeah. India, of course, had a female prime minister before either of our societies did. Obviously, we don't have a woman in the White House just yet. Did that actually do anything to the culture? The fact that there was a woman sitting on top of Indira Gandhi?
I absolutely think so. I mean, yes, she did come from a dynasty. Yes, she did. Nehru, India's first prime minister, was her father. But I think it is about breaking a certain mold that, yes, a woman can fill a man's shoes. Yes, a woman can take up the leadership of the country. And yes, those shoes can be 3-inch heels even, And I think once you get over that, we haven't had another female prime minister, but we've had a female president. For many years, we had almost a de facto woman president and prime minister in Sonia Gandhi. She still is the president of the Congress Party, which is the biggest opposition and which led the country for 10 years before the current prime minister. We have recently, just yesterday, in fact, 2 of India's most important states. Women came back to power for, I think, in one state for the 15th year and for the other, for the other state for the 10th year. So we have very, very strong women leaders. And these women leaders, interesting, none of them are married. They don't have children. They don't have families. So they aren't the stereotypical good Indian women, but they're renegades. They're firebrands. So I do think that we broke that stereotype a very long time ago that women can be effective leaders and they can lead the nation and they can lead the state. We have many, many problems still. We have misogynist male leaders who come and say ludicrous things every day that, women shouldn't be given cell phones because it causes rape. And women shouldn't eat Chinese food because it has hormones in it, which then again causes rape. These are same leaders. I know, exactly. These are the same leaders. These are the men leading states. So I think we have. It is better for women to be leading Indian states or the nation right now. But that said, in the United States, the way I look at it, and I'm not very familiar with American politics, is at the moment. But we have Trump on one hand and Hillary Clinton on the other hand. That to me represent extremes, extreme opposites. And And I really believe that just because policies keep on changing, you know, as you said, words keep on changing. You're radical at one point, you're not, you know, so these things come and go, but just the fact that it's time for the United States to have a woman at its helm. You know, that time has come. When Barack Obama became president, it was time for a black man to lead this nation. So I just feel that once Hillary Clinton does it, you know, to lead the path for so many others, not just in the United States, but around the world, because I do think that these things have these, you know, it encourages women everywhere to step up.
No, I 100% agree. And as we say, you have to see it to be it.
Absolutely.
You know, so for children to grow up understanding that people of different races and men and women can be honored in authority is just hugely, hugely important. I would only add one thing, and that is that it can't be a betrayer of your group. You know, because, I mean, Sarah Palin would not have had the same, the same impact. And you know, there are African-American leaders who are against the majority views of their group. So it has to be somebody who not only physically represents you and looks like you, but somebody who actually doesn't betray you. Right?
Absolutely. And sometimes, you know, it is, and in my experience, sometimes it's women who betray women the most. You know, it's women who actually, in India especially, it's women who are enforcing patriarchy, not the men so much. It's women who raise their sons the way they grow up to be. You know, they raise their women and their daughters and sons so differently.
Well, their whole value is having a son.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so their own value is having a son, but women are not raping women. So, you know, when it comes to violence,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, which is the most severe, right?
But my biggest fear at this moment in time is with American politics is like the next thing we know, Kim Kardashian is running for politics. You know, the way things are going with Trump, and you know, it's just
No, because he is the politics of disappointed masculine privilege. You know, Kim Kardashian is not going to make it.
Laura, this is a pretty painful topic, I think, when we sort of think back to the 2010 election campaign, because I know the world is gripped by the Trump versus Clinton contest, but we had the trial run in 2010, which was Tony Abbott versus Julia Gillard. It's the first female leader of a mainstream political party who runs as Prime Minister, because she became Prime Minister in rather unusual circumstances. And her opponent was the most macho leader of a mainstream political party, I think, in our political history. I think undoubtedly Tony Abbott was, if there was a scale of 1 to 10 on macho, he was about 28. What did that particular contest tell us about us as a nation? And do you see echoes in the Trump versus Clinton contest today? Not so much in public language, but just in the way the society has been polarised by the choice that's been forced on them.
Yeah. Look, people have very strong views about the 2010 to 2013 period in Australia. I don't know, the thing that I think would distinguish it from where I can see what's happening in the States now is that Hillary Clinton is, you know, one tough person. You know, none of this, you know, any of the sort of misogyny level sort of abuse that plays out, I can't see that that's ever going to sort of really play on her, where I think it really did psych Julia Gillard out in the end, and it was a shockingly brutal and awful period, I think, here, in the way that she was treated in public. You know, people saying she should be drowned and all that sort of stuff in a chaff bag, and I mean, all of that stuff was really pretty revolting. But having said that, I think it was such a complex set of circumstances when you look back on it, some of which goes to these sorts of issues that we're talking about anger at loss of the established order, which I don't think had a lot necessarily to do with Julia Gillard and the fact that she was a woman. I think that sort of was just the sort of icing on the cake for a lot of people who were, you know, angry middle-aged men who were raging about it. But, you know, there was this perfect storm of the Labor Party had upset the mining industry. It had upset people. Somehow it had managed to lose the debate on climate change, having started it, which was quite a phenomenal achievement. So there was this sort of strange combination of, structural reasons why she was just left sort of hanging in mid-space with nothing to say, and then you had this relentless negative campaign, which I think is different from what Donald Trump's sort of talking about in a way. I mean, he's...
Well, I don't know. There is something on the web which has a whole long paragraph of accusations that you believe to be Hillary Clinton and turns out to be Julia Gillard. It's exactly the same words, right down to the chicken imagery. And it's very helpful, I think, to see it cross boundaries in that way, because then it helps you recognize that it is misogyny.
And the chicken thing had come originally from something they said about Hillary, I think. So it's a bit circular.
So I mean, it's interchangeable.
Yeah. So that's true. So that's sort of at the level of imagery, and I know that the two of them talked about this. And I think Hillary, when she came out, he sort of took Julia Gillard aside and said, "Look, have they done the one about the chicken yet, or whatever?" And basically, really sort of tried to sort of bolster Julia Gillard up a lot. But I do think you have to look more broadly at all of these other complex factors in that period, and look at sort of why people are angry to start with. But because similarly, I mean, it wasn't a sexist thing as such, but people would be just as angry about and have that visceral reaction to Tony Abbott. People who would regard themselves as very thinking people would say, "I just can't stand the way he walks," and it was that. Oh,
it's true. It's true.
Come on, it's true. So people had these violent reactions, at a sort of really subliminal level to both of them.
No, well, I agree. I mean, the way he walks, okay, that's that's a whole other level of concern. But I do think that we share something else that's so obvious that sometimes we forget about it, and we should say it, which is that, and it does go back to child rearing, which is that we are, for the most part, all of us, women and men, raised primarily by women when we are very small, and we associate female authority with childhood. And a certain emotionality and so on, which, because we haven't seen that many women in public life, just doesn't feel right for public life. We can only imagine men who we've encountered later in our lives, and therefore it feels more rational or whatever. And that's, that's kind of deep. And because I see it in male response, grown-up, smart male response to Hillary Clinton, which, I mean, they say the most incredibly dumb things, on television, like, "I cross my legs whenever I see her." I mean, anyway, it's just terrible things. And I think it's because they feel, when they see a powerful woman, they feel regressed to childhood. They feel unmanned, literally. Because the last time they saw one, they were 8.
Well, I suppose the interesting character in Australian politics in that sense is probably then Bronwyn Bishop, who you probably haven't come across, who Tony Abbott used to refer to. He used to say that he was her sort of love child. It was a joke. But Bronwyn Bishop was this, she's just left politics, and she was this absolutely ferocious figure. And she just scared them all senseless, The whole Liberal Party was terrified. And when it came to, there's now contention about the circumstances, but when it became clear that she should resign as Speaker of the Parliament, nobody was game to, including the Prime Minister, was game to say, "Bronwyn, you've got to go," because they were a bit frightened of it.
No, well, I think that was true of Margaret Thatcher in a way, too, because she was the school marm, so she used it. But I just want to remind us here that the long-term change is going to come. I mean, the deep, deep, deep change comes when both men and women raise children. When men,
I was thinking before we were having this, before we were going to have this conversation about some of these things, and I think about the women who've sort of been successful in Australian politics just in recent years, who we don't sort of go, oh, there's a successful woman necessarily. We just go, oh, she's good. And it's interesting that it's the ones who have the authority of talking about policy, I think, who have really made it without it being a matter of contention. The deputy leader of the party, Julie Bishop, who's the foreign minister, I think is sort of now seen as a credible figure because she speaks with authority on foreign policy. In the Labor Party, people like Jenny Macklin, who've just been there and who've been really big advocates on social policy. Nobody sort of goes, oh, she's there and she's a woman. They have their own authority and there are figures at the state level. And I think this is one of the differences with Hillary Clinton. You know, she's got that unbelievably rich policy pedigree and, you know, across the board social policy.
But you know what's interesting about her, I wonder if this happens here, I don't know, but when Hillary Clinton is in a job, say when she was the senator from the state of New York, she, in that job, gets huge approval ratings. And then as soon as she gets uppity enough to want to do something else, be Secretary of State, they plummet. Then when she's Secretary of State and she's doing a good job, great ratings. But she wants to be president, how dare she, uppity, they plummet again. It's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's true. And the same thing happened with Julia Gillard. You know, she was immensely popular as Deputy Prime Minister, but then uppity and made much more complex by the circumstances, but it just crashed. And it was really only at that point where you started to get this, you know, real visceral sort of reaction to her from people. So.
Now, Laura and Gloria, sorry, I'm going to ask this question together. Of course, late in 2012, for those of us who saw it on TV versus those of us who saw it in the press gallery, there was the misogyny speech when Julia Gillard finally, after 2.5 years, decided to call it out. And she addressed Tony Abbott across the chamber. And I think one of the reasons why that clip bears repeated viewing is that the two of them are there. And you're actually watching Abbott's response to Gillard's lecture. That could have been a turning point for it, but it wasn't. And explain to me why it wasn't, why that was only a temporary blip in her political trajectory. And then I'll throw to Gloria, because I think you've suggested that maybe Hillary Clinton ought to just treat Donald Trump the way he's treated everybody else, and that's just basically yell at him.
Well, this was another sort of controversial moment because the circumstances were that there was a vote on about which would have had the effect of removing the Speaker and changing the numbers in the House, which basically meant the government was teetering out of control of a majority. So all the political journalists are sort of watching the speech and sort of seeing it in the context of that. But she gives this extraordinary speech, and partly because these days, you know, social media and everything, everybody can watch this live. It had this immense reaction as a social statement, people identified with this. I'm not going to be lectured in misogyny by this man, and so there was a social reaction to it. But in a political sense, it didn't. It sort of galvanised people for a while, but it didn't actually change her underlying problems. And this is why I go back to my earlier point that there was this complexity of issues that she was trapped by, going right back to the fact that people still weren't sure why, from the outside, why they toppled Kevin Rudd.
Why she took his job, yeah. And Gloria, it was an interesting, I saw you mention this the other day, that the way to deal with Trump is to basically not so much get down in the gutter with him, but call him out almost in his language. Do you see that?
It's a very hard tactical decision, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if you respond to him, you're getting down to his level, and if you don't, you've let it go free. So, it isn't easy, but I think it's possible. Because, when he was trying to make Hillary Clinton responsible for Bill Clinton's affairs, did you capture this, so how she'd been, an enemy of women and so on and so on. I think she could have used humor by saying, it's so interesting how little Trump understands marriage, considering he's been married so often.
Yeah.
Would that be a job for a running mate, though? To get down and dirty with him? Because I noticed the way
I think that he is so down and dirty, he doesn't need anybody to point it out, actually. Remember this man was a birther. Do you remember the birther movement that was a profoundly racist movement that was saying that President Obama was not eligible to be president because actually he was really, remember that? That he was the prime mover of that. He is so bad, and that's why you see the other very right-wing Republicans who were the other candidates, they feel it's a suicide run because he is so extreme. And they, in some sense, I suppose, they were more dangerous because they actually believe it. He doesn't believe anything. He'll say anything.
That was quite an interesting dynamic, though, amongst all the roosters on the Republican nomination process. A couple of them assumed that there was the presidency waiting for them, whether it was the other Bush or Rubio. Played the statesman. Trump's yapping on in a completely different time-space continuum politically that has ever been seen by a major party candidate before. Then they thought, hang on, this is working for him. He's up about here. Then they started yelling at him, and he went further up.
Well, part of it is the peculiarity of our media industry, too, which is that they function on ratings in order to get ads. And so they kept giving him free time, without any payment. And also he was entertaining, he's like reality television, that's what he was. So it's a kind of phenomenon, that he has just skated through various things that really we should understand are faults, but hadn't been taken advantage of in exactly the same way. But I'm not trying to say that we are not taking this seriously, okay? Because we've all read history and we all know that Hitler was elected, elected on a low voter turnout. So we have a lot of work to do.
Ira, just quickly, one of the things that, because India is obviously the world's largest democracy, it allows pretty much every candidate to vent, and the public language of politics in India is quite hysterical, say vis-a-vis what the Western language had been before the 21st century, if that makes sense. Are you observing certainly in the Trump phenomena and previously, if you were familiar with the sort of Tony Abbott versus Julia Gillard contest, something that's been almost normal language in Indian politics?
So I'm going to first go back to the conversation that we've been having, and I think it's so interesting because I've been listening and in how this deep-set misogyny in politics, it's across the board. You see it in America, you see it with Julia Gillard, with Hillary Clinton, and so much so in India. It's the same problems that we all have about, when women want to become leaders, do they really have to, unsex themselves? Do they have to become men to become politicians and take away all the qualities that make them women? And I find that with Indian politicians, we have that trend. You look at all the leaders, they don't have families, they don't have, and they really project themselves with a lot of masculine energy. They do the same thing. They go on TV and they yell the same way that Trump does, and they don't. And if they do project that empathy and kindness, then they're looked upon as weak. They're not looked upon as strong leaders. So, how do we? So that's sort of I see those similar trends, in all these in all of our countries. That for women to become leaders. Do we have to become men? I mean, can we retain the very feminine qualities and bring them to sort of public life?
No, I hear what you're saying, but it's not true in the U.S. I mean, you can't yell like men and be acceptable. You have to be aware of your perceptions. You're more criticized. But I don't think, but back to your main point, I mean, misogyny is not going to go away easily because it comes from patriarchy, and patriarchy says that women are the means of production to be controlled by men, and it's deep. Hello, it's deep. And racism depends on it, caste depends on it, being able to control reproduction and keep things separate and keep the hierarchy going. It's going to take a while.
So one interesting point was, and you spoke about this with Hillary Clinton when she did well, then people said, this is okay. But when she tried to move up, there was so much resentment. It was ambition that said, how dare she do this?
Yes, right.
But when she did well, they sort of, they said, okay, well, this isn't so bad. So that's what I also think about. And that's why with India, for example, with Indira Gandhi, when she became prime minister, we all know that women can. It broke that mold that it's possible, that women can do this. But I think when women try, that's when that deep set, there's that backlash against this deep set patriarchy that how dare she? She's a,
It's true, but I mean, if Indira Gandhi had had a brother, it would have been
she
all
had
over.
She had a husband who tried, and then actually...
No, but I mean, in terms of...
The succession.
Yeah, we... it's not that we don't have successions, but they're father-son Bush folks and so on. But it is, if there's a strong sense of familial class caste identity, then even the disaster of being a woman is somewhat mitigated.
I'll ask one more question before I take a couple from the live audience. Gloria, you've mentioned in your book, and I know Laura's had this experience a bit over a decade ago. There was an expectation as a journalist that you would barrack for the team. Even though you wrote a lot about feminism, there were choices at one point, certainly through the Obama versus Clinton presidential nomination race in 2008. It becomes a tricky thing when you're also carrying the expectation of the tribe to write a certain way. And then I'll quickly switch to Laura, because the particular example that a lot of people won't remember now, but there was in the day when Carmen Lawrence was in trouble, a lot of women thought that Laura should give Carmen a break, even though she'd made a mistake. But firstly, go to you, because that was quite an interesting contest in 2008. I know you got dragged
2008.
into it. Yeah, you got dragged into a couple of things which probably told you something more about the media culture.
Yeah, no, it was, I mean, I had been saying for ages, people would say, who are you supporting, Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama? And I would say, yes, And I always said, we need 8 years of one and 8 years of the other. It doesn't matter which comes first, and so on. And I ended up supporting Hillary Clinton, even though I did not believe she could win in 2008, just on the merits, because she had so much more experience, especially experience with our deep ultra-right wing, of which Barack Obama had not had the same level of time and experience with. And I think we did see that for his first 2 years in office, he was being a good person and trying to make amends and not understanding, that if the right wing had cancer and he had the cure, they wouldn't accept it, So he didn't understand how kind of hopeless it was. But what's sinister here is that our media constantly ask the question, which is more important, sex or race? Who should come first? That is a fucking outrageous question. What are you talking about? I mean, most women in the world are affected by both. It just drove me crazy. That's what I mean. The world is divided into two kinds of people.
But there was... People who had probably been lifetime supporters of yours were living or dying by the choice you would make. Did you feel that was peculiar to that particular contest, or is it peculiar to this particular era, or has it been the story of the last 50 years?
In point of fact, what happened was that the op-ed page piece I had written for the New York Times said everything I'm already saying, that sex and race are intertwined. You can only, we should have both of them, 8 years of one, 8 years of... And there was one place where in half a sentence I said that sex is probably the most, I've forgotten what the word is, extensive, because it goes... It affects more people, and it's from the kitchen to the White House, something like that. And that was leapt upon as if I had said that sex was more important than race. And it was like the beginning of the Twitter wars, where people take something, half a sentence, and use it as if it's a complete epithet of some kind. Right.
Laura, I'll just give you a quick one, because I was absolutely on your side at this point, but remember there was that expectation that you ought to almost pull a punch, I think.
Carmen Lawrence, who is a fantastic social policy person, one of the breakthrough political leaders in Australia, who made a really, really bad mistake when she was the Premier in Western Australia. Long result was somebody suicided. It was just awful. She was then pursued in a Royal Commission, which was outrageously political. So that was all really terrible. But this thing, it almost became ludicrous where she was going to the Royal Commission and people would keep bringing her these bunches of flowers. And there was this immense expectation grew up, certainly in the press gallery, that if you were a woman, you had to come out and defend her. Now, I thought what was happening to her was bad, but she was the health minister, and my view was, well, hang on, you can't be fronting a Royal Commission and running the health system. You should stand down or stand aside, and it became this big stubborn point. And so I wrote a piece about this and got a bit of a pasting about it. But
it was pre-Twitter though, so you probably got off lightly.
Yeah, I got off lightly. But I mean, it is one of those dilemmas, but it really goes to the point that Gloria's making, which is you've basically got to ultimately decide, who's the best candidate for the job. And it's fantastic that in that race there was a black man who was able to be there and that there was a woman. I mean, that's a huge, huge advance. But you ultimately have to be making decisions that are based on, what's the best outcome for all of us.
Now, as chair, I was supposed to let questions from the audience, but the panel discussion has gone so well, I've sort of judged that we'd let it run.
So do you mind if I ask a question to both of these
please.
both of these ladies for just a second? No, the one thing that I looked at the title of this panel, women should rule the world. And I said, and then I thought to myself, women should rule the world because they can't change the world in a positive way. But what I notice, and this is something that I've been interested in, is when I travel around the world and I speak to women, especially young women, there is so much pressure for young women to change themselves, to look better, and to, especially these days with technology, with Instagram, and everywhere I go, it's becoming a bigger and bigger problem with women, the matter to change themselves and to look good. And I said, listen, we're at the forefront of, a feminist revolution here in India. Does it really matter if you're 3 pounds lighter or heavier? And they say, yes, that's a #1 issue right now. And it's just shocking to me sometimes. And I see it everywhere all over the world. In India, more skin lightening creams are sold than Coca-Cola. In Korea, every 3rd girl between the ages of 18 and 25 gets an eyelid surgery. In America, 1 in every, 70% of college students are suffering from anorexia or bulimia. It's in Brazil and Lebanon, women take up loans, putting their homes in more ancestral property to get plastic surgery done. It's shocking sometimes. I see this around the world, and it's growing more and more. And so I'm just wondering, how are we supposed to change the world when there's so much pressure to change ourselves,
No, I mean, I 100% agree with you, and actually that kind of pressure increases when we start to rebel, because the message is, it isn't what's wrong with society, it's what's wrong with you. So the whole idea, that if you just fix yourself, everything will be fine, becomes more and more and more pressured in every possible way. I agree. It is also why, in a kind of deep anthropological way, women's pattern of activism is the reverse of men's. That is, we're more likely to be somewhat conservative and conformist when we're young and get more steadily radical and rebellious as we get older.
I hear that.
Whereas as the classical pattern of men, except for all the men who are here, but anyway, is to be rebellious in youth and get more conservative with age, because men accumulate power with age as they replace their fathers. Women lose power with age as they replace their mothers. So maybe we should change the title of the panel to "Should Old Women Rule the World?"
Gloria, especially thank you, because you've read the timeline brilliantly. We're actually out of time. I was getting the wind up just a second ago, and that is, you can't top that. Absolutely can't top that. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for our 3 panelists, Gloria, Ira, and Laura.